My wife had strictly forbidden me from visiting her farm, but after her death the lawyer handed me the keys and said now it's yours. I planned to sell it, but out of curiosity, I decided to visit first. When I opened the door, I lost my breath because inside was. You know what they say about curiosity and cats? Yeah, well, apparently nobody told me I was the cat in this scenario. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me back up and explain how I ended up standing in front of a lawyer's mahogany desk, holding a rusty key that looked like it belonged in some medieval dungeon, wondering if my dead wife was still pulling my strings from beyond the grave. When Margaret was alive, and boy, do I miss that woman's sarcastic commentary on my life choices. She had exactly one rule that she never budged on. Not 1 inch. You could negotiate with her about literally anything else. What color to paint the kitchen? She won, obviously. Whether we needed that ridiculously expensive coffee maker, we didn't, but she got it anyway. Or even where to spend our anniversary. Spoiler alert. Never Vegas. But mention her family farm? Game over. End of discussion. Shut down faster than a Windows 95 computer trying to run Netflix. Don't ever step foot on my family farm, Henry, she'd say. And the way she said it wasn't like she was asking me to take out the trash or remember to pick up milk. This was delivered with the kind of finality usually reserved for Supreme Court decisions or my mother-in-law's opinions about my cooking. It was an ironclad, no exceptions, don't even think about it kind of rule. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't argue with her about it. Partly because I respected my wife and her weird family quirks, but mostly because I figured the place was probably some Stephen King horror movie type of situation. You know what I'm talking about. The kind of farm where the cows moo in minor keys, the chickens lay eggs with mysterious symbols on them, and the scarecrow follows you with its button eyes. In my head, I'd constructed this whole narrative about cursed livestock and maybe a few serial killers buried under the corn. Seemed safer to just stay away and let sleeping farm dogs lie, if you catch my drift. But then Margaret went and died on me. Just like that. One day she's complaining about the neighbors playing their music too loud. The next day, I'm picking out funeral flowers and wondering how the hell you're supposed to live without the person who's been your better half for 32 years. The whole thing was surreal, like somebody had changed the channel on my life without asking permission. The will reading was your standard lawyer drama. Lots of stuffy legal language, uncomfortable chairs that probably cost more than my first car, and that particular smell that all law offices seem to have. You know the one. It's like old books mixed with broken dreams and overpriced coffee. I was sitting there, half listening to the lawyer drone on about assets and beneficiaries, when he suddenly stopped talking and gave me this look. This smug little smirk that made me want to ask him if he'd been practicing it in the mirror. Then he slid that key across his desk toward me like he was dealing poker cards in some underground casino. The farm, he said, and his tone had this theatrical quality that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. Now it's yours. My first thought. Sell that sucker faster than concert tickets to a Taylor Swift show. Cash out, take the money, and book myself a nice little retirement setup on some beach in Mexico where the biggest decision I'd have to make was whether to have my margarita with salt or without. I could practically feel the sand between my toes and smell the sunscreen. It seemed like the logical play. Get rid of whatever weirdness Margaret had been protecting me from, pocket the cash, and live out my golden years without having to worry about haunted farm equipment or whatever other nonsense was waiting for me up there. But here's the thing about being married to someone for 3 decades. You start to understand their psychology. And Margaret's psychology was basically this. If she told you not to do something, she was practically daring you to do it. It was like reverse psychology on steroids. She'd banned me from that farm for our entire marriage, which was basically the equivalent of hanging a giant neon sign that said, "World's most interesting place. Henry not allowed." How was I supposed to ignore that? Plus, let's be honest here, when your spouse spends decades keeping you away from somewhere, it's basically an engraved invitation delivered 30 years late. I mean, what kind of self-respecting husband wouldn't be curious? At worst, I figured I'd find some dusty old barns, maybe a few rusty tractors, and enough cobwebs to stock a Halloween store. At best? Well, at best I was picturing buried treasure, hidden cash, or maybe some family heirloom worth enough to fund my Mexican beach retirement, and then some. I should have known better. I should have remembered that Margaret never did anything the simple way. The woman once spent 3 hours researching the best way to organize our spice cabinet, not because she cooked much, but because she wanted to make sure it was optimized for efficiency. She was the type of person who read instruction manuals for fun and actually enjoyed assembling IKEA furniture. Simple wasn't in her vocabulary, but there I was, sitting in that lawyer's office, turning that old key over in my hands and feeling like I was about to open Pandora's box. Except instead of releasing evil into the world, I was probably about to discover why my wife had spent our entire marriage treating her family farm like it was Area 51 with livestock. The smart money said I should listen to Margaret's original rule, sell the place sight unseen, and forget the whole thing. But when has anyone ever accused me of being smart with money? Besides, Margaret wasn't around anymore to enforce her "don't go to the farm" policy, and I was pretty sure she couldn't haunt me for breaking rules she couldn't enforce from 6 feet under. Or so I thought. Turns out, my late wife had plans for me that extended way beyond the grave, and that rusty key was just the beginning of the most complicated inheritance anyone has ever received. But hey, that's a story for another day. 2 days later, I found myself driving through the Canadian countryside in my beat-up Honda Civic, questioning every life decision that had led me to this moment. The GPS kept insisting I turn left at roads that looked more like deer paths, and I was starting to think maybe Margaret had sent me on some elaborate wild goose chase from beyond the grave. Wouldn't put it past her, honestly. The woman once hid my birthday present in 17 different locations just to watch me run around the house like a lunatic for 3 hours. But then I saw it. The sign that made me slam on my brakes so hard I probably left skid marks visible from space. Greenwood Farm. Written in fancy script on what looked like a hand-carved wooden sign that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. This wasn't the rundown, horror movie shack I'd been picturing in my head. This was the kind of place you see on the cover of Country Living magazine. The kind that makes city folks go, ah, and consider giving up their Starbucks addiction to become gentlemen farmers. I'm talking rolling fields that stretched out like green carpet as far as the eye could see, perfectly maintained fencing that looked like it had been installed yesterday, and horses grazing in the distance like they were auditioning for a damn calendar. These weren't your typical farm horses either. These were the kind of horses rich people buy to make themselves feel more interesting. Gorgeous, well-groomed animals that probably ate better than I did and definitely had better health care. The farmhouse itself looked like something straight out of a PBS period drama. I'm talking full-on country estate here, the kind of place where you half expected to see Hugh Jackman riding up on horseback, tipping his hat, and speaking with a charming accent about the virtues of rural living. It was big enough to host the entire cast of Downton Abbey for a weekend retreat, complete with servants' quarters and probably a wine cellar that would make sommelier weep with joy. As I drove up the gravel path, and yes, it was that perfect crunchy gravel that makes you feel like you're in a movie, I couldn't stop muttering to myself like some kind of deranged tour guide. Margaret, if you're haunting this place, blink twice. Actually, scratch that. If you're haunting this place, maybe give me a heads up about what the hell I'm walking into here, because this is not what I signed up for when I married a girl from Alberta. The gate had opened automatically when I approached, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't your average family farm. Most farms I'd been to, you had to get out and wrestle with a rusty chain and a padlock that looked like it had survived both world wars. But this was some high-tech setup that probably cost more than my first house. I parked the Civic next to what I can only describe as the most intimidating front door I'd ever seen in my life. Solid wood, probably oak, with brass fixtures that gleamed like they'd been polished that morning. The kind of door that made you want to straighten your tie and practice your handshake before knocking. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, key in hand, wondering if I was about to walk into some kind of elaborate practical joke. When I finally worked up the courage to unlock that door and step inside, my jaw didn't just hit the floor, it crashed through the floor, down into the basement, and probably kept going until it reached the Earth's core. Because what I found inside wasn't dust, cobwebs, or the mouse convention I'd been expecting. It was like walking into a personal museum that someone had decorated with the express purpose of making me feel like a complete peasant. We're talking paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in the Louvre, not some random farm in the middle of nowhere. Sculptures positioned around the room like they'd been placed by an interior designer with a PhD in making people feel inadequate. And the furniture? Let me put it this way. I was afraid to sit down because I was pretty sure everything in that room cost more than my annual salary. But it was the shelves that really got me. Shelves lined every wall, and they were stacked with what I can only describe as the kind of stuff you see in those fancy auction houses on TV. Crystal that probably had its own insurance policy, books that looked like they'd been bound by hand in some medieval monastery, and art pieces that made me wonder if my wife had been secretly moonlighting as an art dealer or maybe running some kind of high-end smuggling operation. I wandered through that house like a tourist in a museum, afraid to touch anything and half convinced that some security alarm was going to start blaring the moment I breathed too close to one of those paintings. Every room was more impressive than the last. The kitchen looked like something you'd see on the Food Network, complete with commercial-grade appliances and counter space that could double as a landing strip for small aircraft. The living room had a fireplace big enough to roast an entire pig, surrounded by furniture that probably had pedigrees and came with their own certificates of authenticity. And then there was the library. Oh, the library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions, leather-bound classics, and what looked like some kind of rare manuscript collection that belonged in the Smithsonian. I pulled out one book at random and nearly dropped it when I saw it was signed by the author. Not a printed signature, an actual, hand-signed inscription that probably made the book worth more than my car. The whole time I'm exploring this place, I keep thinking the same thing over and over. Margaret, what the hell were you hiding from me? Because this wasn't just a family farm. This was an estate, a compound, a freaking fortress of luxury disguised as agricultural property. The woman I'd been married to for 32 years had been sitting on what was basically a small country, and she'd never said a word about it. I started doing the math in my head, trying to figure out how much money was sitting in this house alone, and I kept coming up with numbers that made me dizzy. We're talking serious wealth here, the kind of money that changes your life and probably the lives of everyone you've ever met. And Margaret had kept it secret for our entire marriage, letting me worry about mortgage payments and retirement funds while she was sitting on enough assets to buy a small island. By the time I made it back to the front room, my head was spinning with questions, and my bank account was having what could only be described as an existential crisis. After spending what felt like 3 hours wandering through Margaret's secret palace of luxury, trying to wrap my brain around the fact that my supposedly humble farm girl wife had been living like some kind of undercover aristocrat, I finally made it back to what I assumed was the main living area. And that's when I saw it, sitting there like the centerpiece of some elaborate romantic gesture that Margaret had probably spent weeks planning. Front and center on an antique desk that probably cost more than most people's cars was a sleek laptop computer, and draped across it, I kid you not, was a single red rose. Just lying there like this was some kind of Nicholas Sparks movie, and Margaret was about to appear in a flowing dress, ready to run toward me in slow motion through a field of wheat. Now, I've got to admit, the whole setup was romantic as hell. The kind of romantic that makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, like maybe your wife really did love you enough to orchestrate this whole elaborate surprise from beyond the grave. But it was also creepy in that particular way that only dead spouse-related surprises can be. Because let's face it, when you're standing in a house that your deceased wife apparently owned but never told you about, and there's a laptop with a rose on it just sitting there waiting for you, you start wondering if maybe she's been planning this whole thing for years. Attached to the rose was a little sticky note, the kind Margaret used to leave on the bathroom mirror when she wanted to remind me to pick up milk or stop leaving my socks on the bedroom floor. But this one just had 2 words written in her unmistakably neat handwriting. For Henry. That's me, in case you haven't been paying attention. I picked up that rose like it might explode in my hands, half expecting some kind of booby trap to go off, or maybe a recording of Margaret's voice to start playing, telling me I'd triggered some elaborate security system. But nothing happened. Just me, standing in this ridiculously fancy house, holding a rose and staring at a laptop like it was going to reveal the secrets of the universe. The laptop itself was one of those expensive models that tech nerds drool over, the kind that makes that satisfying little chime when you open it up. And sure enough, when I lifted the screen, it came to life immediately, like it had been waiting for me this whole time. The screen showed a password prompt, which shouldn't have surprised me because Margaret was the kind of person who put passwords on everything, including the coffee maker. I swear, the woman would have put a password on the toilet if she could have figured out how to install the necessary technology. But underneath the password box was another one of her sticky notes. Password is the day we met plus my maiden name. And that's when I realized Margaret was still messing with me, even from beyond the grave, because she knew damn well that my memory for dates was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to dig through the cobwebs in my brain to remember exactly when we'd first met. Was it September? October? And was it the 15th or the 16th? I knew it was at that godforsaken bowling alley downtown. The one with the sticky floors and the beer that tasted like it had been filtered through a gym sock. Margaret never let me live down the fact that I'd thrown nothing but gutter balls that entire first date, and she'd beaten me by about 50 points while wearing heels that were completely inappropriate for bowling. After about 10 minutes of muttering dates under my breath, and probably looking like I was having some kind of mental breakdown, I finally remembered. September 16th, 1991. Her maiden name was Patterson. So the password was 091691 Patterson, assuming Margaret hadn't decided to get creative with the formatting. Because knowing her, she probably would have thrown in some capital letters or special characters just to watch me struggle. But no, apparently she'd taken pity on me for once in her life, because 091691 Patterson worked like a charm. The laptop unlocked, and immediately the screen filled with a video file that started playing automatically. And there she was, Margaret. My Margaret, looking healthy and vibrant and very much alive, which was particularly jarring considering she was supposed to be dead. She was sitting in what looked like this very room, probably recorded this video right here at this desk, and she was smiling that same smile she used to give me when she was about to tell me something I wasn't going to want to hear. "Hello, Henry," she said, and hearing her voice again hit me like a truck full of emotions I wasn't prepared to deal with. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you've finally made it to the farm." My immediate reaction was to talk back to the screen like she could hear me, which I realize makes me sound like a crazy person, but grief does weird things to your brain. "Of course," I said to the laptop, loud enough that if there were any neighbors within a mile radius, they probably thought I was losing my mind. "Leave me a farm I didn't know existed, a cryptic video message, and probably a murder mystery to solve while you're at it. Thanks, honey. Really appreciate the posthumous drama." But Margaret wasn't done with her video yet. She leaned forward slightly, and I could see that glint in her eyes that she always got when she was about to drop some kind of bombshell on me. It was the same look she'd given me when she told me she'd invited her mother to stay with us for 3 weeks, or when she informed me that she'd signed us up to host the neighborhood block party without consulting me first. "I know you're probably confused right now," she continued, and I had to laugh because confused was putting it mildly. I was beyond confused. I was in some kind of emotional and mental free fall, trying to process the fact that my wife had apparently been leading a double life that involved luxury estates and secret video messages. "And I know you're probably wondering why I never told you about this place." "Oh, I'm wondering about a lot more than that," I muttered back at the screen, because talking to recorded messages was apparently my new coping mechanism. "Like how the hell you afforded all this, and why our house back home had that leak in the bathroom ceiling if you were sitting on enough money to buy half of Canada." But Margaret kept talking, because that's what recorded messages do. They don't wait for your sarcastic commentary or emotional processing time. "There are things about my family that I never told you, Henry. Things I thought I could keep buried forever. But it turns out the past has a way of catching up with you, whether you want it to or not." Just as I was starting to recover from the emotional whiplash of watching my dead wife deliver cryptic messages from what was apparently her secret lair, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel outside. And not just any tires. These were the kind of tires that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, the kind that whisper, "I have money and I want everyone to know it," as they roll over perfectly maintained driveways. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop faster than my credit score after Christmas shopping. Rolling up the driveway was a black SUV that screamed, "We're here on serious business, and we probably have lawyers on speed dial." It was one of those massive, intimidating vehicles that suburban moms drive to soccer practice, but somehow looks menacing when it's approaching your house uninvited. The kind of car that makes you wonder if you're about to get served with legal papers or invited to join a very exclusive and probably illegal country club. Out of this automotive monument to intimidation stepped 3 men who looked like they'd been ordered from a catalog called Generic Rich Guys Who Think They're Better Than You. They moved with that particular swagger that comes from a lifetime of having money solve all their problems, the kind of walk that says, "We've never had to wait in line at the DMV, and we're not about to start now." These were Margaret's siblings, and I recognized them immediately, even though I'd only seen them a handful of times at family gatherings where they'd spent most of their time acting like I was some kind of charity case Margaret had picked up at a bus station. Gerald, Thomas, and Patrick, the unholy trinity of condescension, each one perfectly groomed and wearing the kind of clothes that come with care instructions more complicated than assembling IKEA furniture. Gerald was the oldest and clearly the self-appointed leader of this little delegation. He had that distinguished gray-at-the-temples thing going on that made him look like he should be running for senator or selling luxury cars to people with more money than sense. His suit probably cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 5 years, and he wore it with the confidence of someone who'd never had to check his bank balance before making a purchase. Thomas was the middle brother, and you could tell he spent most of his time trying to keep up with Gerald while simultaneously plotting to overthrow him. He had that hungry look in his eyes that screams, "I'm second in command, but I should be first," and his handshake was probably practiced in the mirror every morning to achieve maximum intimidation factor. His whole vibe was corporate shark who eats smaller fish for breakfast and considers it networking. And then there was Patrick, the youngest, who gave off the energy of someone who'd been riding his family's coattails his entire life and was perfectly content to keep doing so until the coattails wore out. He was the kind of guy who probably introduced himself at parties by mentioning his family's net worth within the first 30 seconds of conversation. His smile was all teeth and no warmth, like a crocodile that had learned how to wear expensive cologne. They marched up to the front door like they were leading a military parade, their formation so perfect you'd think they'd rehearsed this whole approach in their country club's boardroom. Gerald took point, of course, because heaven forbid one of his younger brothers should be the first to speak. He knocked on the door with the kind of authoritative rap that suggested he was used to doors opening immediately upon his arrival, probably accompanied by servants offering champagne and small talk about the weather. "Henry," he called out, and his voice carried that particular tone that wealthy people use when they're trying to sound reasonable, but really just sound patronizing. "Henry, open up. We need to talk about the farm." I was still standing in the living room, surrounded by Margaret's secret luxury collection and holding the laptop like it was some kind of shield against whatever fresh hell was about to walk through that door. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, maybe hide behind one of those ridiculously expensive sculptures until they gave up and went away. But then I realized that my beat-up Honda Civic was sitting right there in the driveway like a neon sign announcing, "The peasant is definitely home." So instead, I did what any rational person would do when faced with 3 wealthy relatives who clearly wanted something from them. I whispered back to myself like some kind of deranged narrator. "Yeah, and I need to talk about why you all look like villains from a Netflix drama. Did you guys coordinate those outfits? Or do all rich people just naturally gravitate toward the same, 'we're here to steal your inheritance' look?" Through the window, I could see them exchanging glances, the kind of looks that said they were already planning their next move, and it probably involved lawyers, legal documents, and a whole lot of paperwork designed to make my life as complicated as possible. Gerald checked his watch, probably a Rolex worth more than my annual salary, and I could practically see him calculating how long he was willing to wait before escalating to whatever plan B they'd discussed during the drive over. Thomas was scanning the property like he was taking inventory, probably already mentally dividing up the assets and figuring out how to convert everything into cold hard cash as quickly as possible. His eyes had that predatory gleam that comes from seeing dollar signs, and I wouldn't have been surprised if he'd already contacted a real estate agent and an auction house before they'd even gotten out of the car. Patrick, meanwhile, was taking pictures with his phone, trying to be subtle about it, but failing miserably because subtlety clearly wasn't a skill they taught at whatever fancy prep school had produced these 3 specimens. He was documenting everything like he was building a case, which honestly wouldn't have surprised me given what I was learning about Margaret's family dynamics. I made a decision that was either brilliantly strategic or completely stupid, depending on your perspective. I locked the front door, ignored them completely, and went back to Margaret's laptop. If my dead wife had gone to the trouble of setting up this whole elaborate video message system, Then I figured she probably had more to tell me than just cryptic references to buried family secrets. And if these three vultures wanted to have a conversation about the farm, they could damn well wait until I'd figured out what Margaret actually wanted me to know. Because something told me that whatever Margaret had recorded for me was going to be a whole lot more useful than whatever sales pitch her brothers were preparing to deliver on my doorstep. The next morning rolled around like a hangover after a particularly regrettable New Year's Eve party, and I woke up on what had to be the most expensive couch I'd ever slept on. My back was killing me, which seemed pretty ironic considering this piece of furniture probably cost more than most people's cars and was supposedly designed for comfort. But I guess when you spend the night tossing and turning because your dead wife is apparently running some kind of posthumous mystery game, even a couch that belongs in a museum can't help you get a decent night's sleep. I'd managed to avoid Margaret's brothers the day before by basically turning into a hermit and pretending the doorbell was broken, but I knew they weren't going to give up that easily. These were the kind of people who probably had persistence tattooed somewhere on their souls, right next to entitlement, and we deserve your stuff. So I figured I'd better start exploring this place and figure out what exactly Margaret had left me before her siblings decided to take a more direct approach to getting what they wanted. After making myself a cup of coffee in a kitchen that was fancier than most restaurants, I decided to wander outside and check out the rest of the property. The morning air was crisp and clean in that way that makes city people write bad poetry about the virtues of rural living, and I had to admit the view was pretty spectacular. Rolling hills, perfectly maintained fencing, and those calendar-worthy horses I'd noticed the day before, still grazing like they were posing for a tourism brochure. I was walking toward what looked like the main stable building, trying to figure out if I was supposed to do something with these horses or if they were just decorative livestock, when I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man appeared seemingly out of nowhere, like he'd materialized from thin air or maybe been hiding behind a hay bale waiting for the perfect moment to give me a heart attack. Jesus Christ, I yelped, probably loud enough to wake up half the county. My fight-or-flight response kicked in, and since I'm not exactly built for fighting, I took a step back and tried to look like I belonged there instead of like some city slicker who'd wandered onto private property by accident. The guy just laughed, which was either reassuring or terrifying, depending on your perspective. He was probably in his 60s, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending decades working outdoors and probably not caring much about sunscreen or skincare routines. His hands looked like they'd been carved out of tree bark, all rough and scarred from what was clearly a lifetime of manual labor, and he was wearing one of those cowboy hats that somehow managed to look both practical and slightly ridiculous at the same time. "Sorry about that," he said, and his voice had that slow, measured quality that people from rural areas seem to develop, like they've got all the time in the world and nowhere urgent to be. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Arthur." He stuck out one of those tree bark hands, and I shook it, trying not to wince at his grip, which felt like it could crush walnuts without breaking a sweat. "Henry," I managed, still trying to get my heart rate back to something resembling normal. You work here?" Arthur nodded, adjusting his hat in that particular way that guys who wear hats all the time seem to have perfected. "Your wife hired me to manage the horses," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd been expecting me, which was more than I could say for myself since I'd been expecting maybe some old farm equipment and a lot of dust. "Horses," I repeated, like I was learning a new language. "Right, the horses." Because apparently my vocabulary had been reduced to repeating words back to people like some kind of confused parrot. Arthur started walking toward the stable, clearly expecting me to follow, so I did, trying to look like I knew what I was doing instead of like someone who'd never been closer to a horse than the ones on the carousel at the county fair. "She spent the last few years of her life fixing this place up," he explained as we walked. "Had big plans for it, she did. Always talking about how someday her husband would come see what she'd built." Well, that was news to me. Margaret had been planning for me to visit this place? The same Margaret who'd banned me from stepping foot on her family farm for our entire marriage? I was starting to feel like I'd been married to a completely different person than I thought. Like maybe my wife had been leading some kind of double life that involved secret estates and long-term plans she'd never bothered to mention during our morning coffee conversations. The stable turned out to be just as impressive as everything else on this property. We're talking about a building that was bigger and probably better maintained than most people's houses, with stalls that looked like they'd been designed by someone who took horse comfort very seriously. Everything was clean, organized, and clearly expensive, from the automatic water systems to the kind of lighting that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment back home. 6 horses, Arthur said with obvious pride, like he was showing off his own children. All of them beauties. Margaret picked each one herself, spent months finding exactly the right animals. He led me down the center aisle of the stable, pointing out each horse like he was giving me a personal tour of some kind of equine art gallery. And I've got to admit, they were impressive animals. Big, muscular, and clearly well cared for, with coats that gleamed like they'd been polished and eyes that suggested they were probably smarter than I was. These weren't your typical farm horses that spent their days pulling plows or giving pony rides to kids at birthday parties. These were the kind of horses that rich people bought to make themselves feel more connected to nature while still maintaining their comfortable distance from actual farm work. I walked up to one of them, a massive bay gelding that Arthur introduced as Thunder, and tentatively reached out to pat his nose. Because that's what you do with horses, right? You pat their noses and they're supposed to like it? Well, Thunder apparently had different ideas about our introduction, because the moment my hand made contact with his muzzle, he sneezed. Right in my face. A full-on, wet, horse-sized sneeze that covered me in what I can only assume was horse snot. Arthur burst out laughing. Slapping his knee like this was the funniest thing he'd seen all year. "He likes you," he said, which made me wonder what Thunder did to people he didn't like, because if this was his version of affection, I wasn't sure I wanted to experience his disapproval. I wiped my face with my sleeve, muttering under my breath, "Great. Day 2 of farm life, and I'm already being bullied by livestock. Margaret, wherever you are, I hope you're enjoying this." After Thunder's charming introduction to my face and sinuses, Arthur seemed to decide that I'd had enough horse-related humiliation for one morning. But instead of letting me retreat to the safety of the house to recover what was left of my dignity, he got this look in his eyes that I'd seen before. Usually right before someone was about to tell me something that would completely upend my understanding of reality. He glanced around the stable like he was checking for spies or maybe government surveillance drones, then leaned in closer with the kind of conspiratorial energy that made me wonder if I was about to become an unwilling participant in some kind of agricultural espionage. His voice dropped to just above a whisper, which seemed unnecessarily dramatic considering we were the only 2 people within probably a 5-mile radius, unless you counted the horses, and they didn't strike me as the type to gossip. "There's something you need to see," Arthur said, and the way he said it made my stomach do that uncomfortable flip-flop thing that usually happens right before someone shows you something that's going to make your life significantly more complicated. "Your wife, she made me promise to show you when the time was right. Reckon that time is now." I wanted to ask him what qualified as the right time, in his professional opinion, and whether getting sneezed on by a horse was some kind of rural initiation ritual that officially made me ready for whatever Margaret had hidden on this property. But something in Arthur's expression told me this wasn't the moment for my usual sarcastic commentary, so I just nodded and followed him like a sheep being led to slaughter, which honestly felt pretty accurate given how my week had been going. Arthur led me toward what looked like the oldest barn on the property, a weathered wooden structure that seemed to have been built back when people actually used barns for storing hay instead of housing luxury vehicles and craft beer brewing operations. Unlike everything else on this estate, this barn looked authentically rustic, with the kind of character that comes from decades of actual farm work rather than careful restoration by people with more money than practical sense. Inside, the barn was exactly what you'd expect from an old farm building, dusty, full of hay bales, and smelling like a combination of dried grass and time itself. Arthur moved through the space like he'd done this before, heading straight for a section of hay bales that looked exactly like every other section of hay bales to my untrained city boy eyes. "Help me move these," Arthur said, grabbing one end of a bale that probably weighed more than my first apartment's security deposit. I grabbed the other end and immediately regretted every day I'd spent sitting behind a desk instead of doing manual labor, because apparently hay bales are significantly heavier than they look on TV. We moved about 6 of these agricultural torture devices, and that's when I saw it. A section of the barn floor that looked different from the rest. Not obviously different, mind you. Margaret hadn't been sloppy about hiding whatever this was. But once you knew what to look for, You could see that this particular area had been carefully constructed to blend in while still being accessible. Arthur reached down and pulled on what I'd assumed was just another floorboard, and the whole section lifted up like a trapdoor in some kind of spy movie. Underneath was a ladder leading down into what appeared to be a tunnel or underground room, lit by the kind of professional lighting system that definitely hadn't come from the local hardware store. Either my wife was Batman, I muttered, staring down into this hidden entrance, or she was preparing for World War III. Because honestly, at this point in my posthumous scavenger hunt, discovering that Margaret had been leading a double life as a superhero would have been less surprising than finding out she'd just been really good at keeping secrets about real estate. Arthur chuckled and started climbing down the ladder like this was the most normal thing in the world, which made me wonder exactly how much weird stuff he'd seen while working for my apparently mysterious wife. I followed him down, trying not to think about all the horror movies that started with people climbing into underground spaces that probably hadn't been inspected by anyone from the county building department. What I found at the bottom of that ladder was not what I'd been expecting, which at this point was saying something, because my expectations had already been recalibrated about 17 times since arriving at this place. Instead of some kind of doomsday prepper setup or maybe a wine cellar, I found myself in what could only be described as a command center that would have made NASA jealous. The space was bigger than my living room back home, with concrete walls that had been finished to look more like an upscale office than an underground bunker. There were multiple desks, each equipped with computers and filing systems that looked like they'd been organized by someone with a degree in library science and a serious case of OCD. Maps covered one entire wall, not just regular maps, but geological surveys, topographical charts, and what looked like official government documents that probably required security clearances to access. What the hell? I whispered, because whispering seemed appropriate when you're standing in your dead wife's secret underground lair that she apparently forgot to mention during 32 years of marriage. Arthur walked over to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a folder that was thick enough to double as a weapon. Oil surveys, he said, like that explained everything. Your wife spent the last 5 years having this property surveyed by the best geological teams money could buy. Turns out this farm is sitting on enough oil to make you richer than some small countries. I took the folder from him with hands that were definitely shaking, because discovering that you're suddenly wealthy is apparently just as terrifying as discovering that you're broke, just in a completely different way. The papers inside were covered with technical terms and numbers that might as well have been written in ancient Egyptian for all the sense they made to me. But the summary page was clear enough. This property contained oil reserves that were worth more money than I'd ever imagined existed outside of lottery commercials. Margaret documented everything. Arthur continued, pulling out more folders and laying them on one of the desks like he was setting up for the world's most expensive show-and-tell presentation. Every survey, every test, every legal document. She knew her family would come sniffing around eventually, and she wanted to make sure you had all the ammunition you needed. That's when it hit me. Margaret hadn't just been keeping secrets. She'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, setting up a game that would continue long after she was gone. Just when I thought I was starting to get a handle on Margaret's elaborate posthumous chess game, life decided to throw me another curveball that hit me right in the emotional gut. I was sitting in the underground command center, surrounded by enough oil survey documents to wallpaper a small city, trying to wrap my brain around the fact that I was apparently sitting on enough crude oil to fund a small war, when I heard the unmistakable sound of another car pulling up the driveway. But this wasn't the intimidating rumble of another expensive SUV carrying Margaret's vulture siblings. This was the familiar wheeze and rattle of a 10-year-old Honda Accord that needed a new muffler and probably a miracle to pass its next inspection. I knew that sound better than my own heartbeat because I'd been listening to it for the past 3 years, ever since our daughter Lily had graduated college and started driving the same car she'd had since her junior year of high school. My heart did that thing parents' hearts do when they see their kids, a combination of pure joy and immediate panic, because you're always happy to see them but also terrified about what crisis might have brought them to your doorstep unannounced. Especially when your doorstep happens to be a secret luxury estate that you've only known about for 48 hours and are still trying to figure out yourself. I climbed out of Margaret's underground CIA operation and jogged toward the house, getting there just in time to see Lily emerge from her car looking like she'd been crying for about 3 days straight. Which, knowing our daughter, she probably had been. Lily was the kind of person who felt everything at maximum volume, whether it was joy, anger, or grief. She'd inherited that from Margaret, along with her mother's stubborn streak and unfortunate tendency to trust people who didn't deserve it. "Dad," she said, and her voice had that shaky quality that immediately made me want to hunt down whoever had hurt her and have a very serious conversation about why that was a bad life choice. She was wearing one of Margaret's old sweaters, which hit me like a punch to the solar plexus because it meant she was trying to feel close to her mom, and that meant she was hurting even worse than I'd thought. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug that probably lasted longer than either of us intended. "What are you doing here? Not that I'm not happy to see you, but this place is kind of complicated right now." She pulled back and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of Margaret's sweater, leaving mascara streaks that made her look younger than her 26 years. "Uncle Gerald called me," she said, and immediately my blood pressure spiked to levels that probably required medical intervention. "He said you'd inherited Mom's family farm and that you were being unreasonable about sharing it with the family." Of course he had. Of course Gerald had called our grieving daughter and fed her some sob story about me and old dad hoarding the family inheritance like some kind of miser. Because apparently having 3 grown men show up to intimidate me wasn't enough. They had to drag my kid into their little power play too. "They just want what's fair, Dad," Lily continued, and I could hear Gerald's words coming out of her mouth like he'd been coaching her on the drive over. "Uncle Gerald said Mom always intended for the farm to be shared among all the family members, and that keeping it all to yourself isn't what she would have wanted." I felt my eye twitch, which is what happens when I'm trying very hard not to say something that would require me to put money in the swear jar. "Fair," I repeated, and I'm pretty sure my tone made it clear what I thought about Gerald's definition of fairness. "And what exactly did Uncle Gerald tell you about this farm, honey?" Lily looked confused, which was understandable since Gerald had probably given her the abridged, heavily edited version of events that painted him and his brothers as the innocent victims of my sudden greed. "He said it was the family homestead where Mom grew up, and that it has sentimental value for all of them. He said you were refusing to even let them visit." I wanted to laugh, but it would have been the kind of laugh that would have worried my daughter and possibly attracted the attention of mental health professionals. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried to figure out how to explain to my grieving child that her beloved uncles were basically the human equivalent of vultures circling roadkill. "Lily," I said carefully, "how much do you know about your mother's relationship with her family?" She shrugged, which told me everything I needed to know. Margaret had been just as secretive with our daughter as she'd been with me, protecting her from whatever dysfunction had driven her to ban me from this place for 3 decades. I mean, we didn't see them very often, but that's normal for families that live far apart, right? And they were always nice to me at Christmas and stuff. Oh, they were nice to her at Christmas. Of course they were. Because Lily represented a potential ally, someone they could manipulate if they ever needed to get to Margaret through her family. They'd probably been grooming her for years, being the fun uncles who sent expensive birthday presents and remembered to call on holidays, building up a reservoir of goodwill they could cash in when they needed it. "Dad, you look like you're about to have a stroke," Lily said, and I realized my face was probably doing that thing it does when I'm processing information that makes me want to punch walls. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." I lied, because what else was I supposed to say? "It's just that there's a lot about this situation that you don't know yet. Your uncles aren't exactly telling you the whole truth about this place." Lily's expression shifted from concern to that particular brand of defensiveness that young adults get when they think their parents are being unfairly critical of people they like. "Dad, I know you and Mom's family never really got along, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. Maybe this is a chance to finally build some bridges." Build some bridges. Right. Like her uncles were interested in family reconciliation instead of family assets. I could see Gerald's fingerprints all over this conversation, the way he'd positioned himself as the reasonable family member trying to heal old wounds while painting me as the stubborn outsider causing unnecessary drama. I realized I was going to have to show her Margaret's videos. There was no other way to make her understand what we were really dealing with here. 3 days later, Margaret's brothers came back with reinforcements, and let me tell you, they'd clearly spent those 3 days strategizing like they were planning the D-Day invasion. This time, they didn't just roll up in their intimidating black SUV. They brought a whole convoy that looked like a Fortune 500 company's board of directors had decided to go on a hostile takeover field trip. Leading the parade was Gerald in his usual mobile monument to wealth, followed by what appeared to be a silver Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's houses. And bringing up the rear was a white Range Rover that screamed, "I have so much money, I don't even bother to check the price of gas." The whole procession moved with the kind of choreographed precision that suggested they'd rehearsed this approach, probably in some corporate boardroom over expensive whiskey and cigars. I watched this automotive power play unfold from the living room window, feeling like I was about to face down the final boss in some kind of twisted video game where the prize wasn't points or extra lives, but my dead wife's secret oil fortune. Lily was sitting on the couch behind me, still wearing Margaret's sweater and looking like she was caught between wanting to support her father and believing her uncle's version of family harmony. "Dad," she said quietly, "maybe you should just hear what they have to say. They brought someone with them. Looks official." Official, right? Because nothing says family reconciliation like bringing what was clearly a corporate suit to a conversation about inherited property. I could already see how this was going to play out. They'd parade some expert in front of us, someone with impressive credentials and a briefcase full of papers designed to make me feel stupid for not immediately signing over everything Margaret had left me. Out of the Mercedes stepped a man in his 50s wearing the kind of suit that probably came with its own tax bracket. Everything about him screamed oil executive, from his perfectly styled hair that defied both gravity and the laws of nature, to his shoes that gleamed like they'd been polished by a team of professionals with advanced degrees in footwear maintenance. He carried himself with that particular swagger that comes from spending your entire career convincing people to sell you things for less than they're worth. The Range Rover disgorged 2 more suits, younger guys who looked like they'd been hired straight out of business school and trained to nod enthusiastically at everything the older guy said. They flanked him like bodyguards, except instead of protecting him from physical threats, they were probably there to provide backup intimidation and take notes on whatever psychological warfare tactics worked best on stubborn widowers. Gerald led this little delegation up to the front door, and this time he didn't bother with the polite knocking routine. He pressed the doorbell with the confidence of someone who was absolutely certain the door was going to open, probably because he'd brought enough firepower to make refusal seem futile. But here's the thing about being married to Margaret for 32 years. You learn a few things about strategic thinking. And Margaret had taught me, through years of marriage and apparently months of posthumous planning, that the best defense against people who think they're smarter than you is to let them believe they actually are smarter than you, right up until the moment you prove them wrong. So instead of hiding or pretending I wasn't home like I had before, I did something that probably surprised them. I opened the door, smiled like I was genuinely happy to see them, and invited them all inside like I was hosting a dinner party for my closest friends. "Gerald, Thomas, Patrick," I said with enough enthusiasm to power a small solar panel. "And you brought friends. How wonderful. Please, come in. I was just about to make some coffee." The look of confusion on Gerald's face was absolutely priceless. He'd clearly been prepared for resistance, defensiveness, maybe even outright hostility. What he hadn't been prepared for was cheerful hospitality from someone who was acting like this whole thing was just a delightful social visit. I led them into the dining room, which Margaret had apparently designed specifically for intimidating visitors. The table was massive, made from some kind of wood that probably had its own endangered species protection status, and surrounded by chairs that looked like they belonged in a medieval castle. I gestured for everyone to sit down like I was conducting a business meeting, which I guess I was, except I was the only one who knew what business we were actually conducting. "So," I said, settling into the chair at the head of the table like I'd been born to sit there, "I assume you gentlemen are here to discuss the farm. And you are." I looked directly at the oil executive, who was clearly used to being the most important person in any room he entered. "Richard Pemberton," he said, extending a hand that felt like it had never done a day of manual labor in its life. "I represent Consolidated Energy Solutions. We've been working with your brothers-in-law on a potential development opportunity." Brothers-in-law. I liked how he phrased that, like Gerald, Thomas, and Patrick had any legal claim to Margaret's property or any right to negotiate on my behalf. But I just nodded and smiled like this all made perfect sense. "How nice," I said. "Well, before we get into any business discussions, I thought you might be interested in seeing some materials my wife left for me. She was very thorough about documenting everything related to this property. That's when I pulled out my laptop, Margaret's laptop, and set it on the table like I was about to give a PowerPoint presentation to the board of directors. Which, in a way, I was, except this presentation was going to be more like a masterclass in how to get completely outmaneuvered by a dead woman. I hit play on one of Margaret's videos, the one where she explained exactly what she thought of her brother's business ethics and their lifelong habit of trying to profit from family relationships. Watching their faces as Margaret's voice filled the room, laying out their history of financial manipulation and family exploitation, was like watching a slow-motion car accident where all the passengers deserved exactly what was happening to them. But the real piece de resistance came when I pulled out the oil surveys, the real ones, not whatever watered-down version Gerald and his corporate buddy had been working with. The surveys that showed exactly how much oil was actually under this property, and more importantly, which sections of the land contained the most valuable deposits. Richard Pemberton's face went through about 17 different expressions in the span of 30 seconds, starting with confusion and ending with the kind of pale realization that comes when you discover you've been trying to buy the Mona Lisa for the price of a garage sale painting. I thought the great oil survey revelation would be the end of it. I figured after watching their corporate buddy Richard Pemberton realize he'd been trying to lowball me on what amounted to a geological lottery ticket, Margaret's brothers would slink back to whatever country club they'd crawled out of and lick their wounds in private. Maybe complain to their golf buddies about how their dead sister had somehow managed to outsmart them from beyond the grave, then go back to their regular routine of being wealthy and entitled. But apparently, I'd underestimated both their desperation and their capacity for shameless behavior, because 2 days later, Gerald showed up at my door again. Except this time, he wasn't flanked by his brothers or accompanied by oil executives in expensive suits. This time, he was alone, and he looked like he'd aged about 10 years since our last encounter. The man standing on my doorstep barely resembled the confident, smug corporate shark who tried to intimidate me earlier that week. Gerald's usually perfect hair was disheveled. His expensive suit looked like he'd slept in it, and his face had a pale, sweaty quality that made me wonder if he was coming down with the flu or having some kind of medical emergency right there on my front porch. "Henry," he said, and his voice had none of its usual commanding authority. Instead, he sounded like someone who'd been running on coffee and desperation for about 48 hours straight. "I need to talk to you. Please. It's important." Now, every instinct I had was telling me to slam the door in his face and maybe invest in some better security for this place. Because people who'd recently tried to steal your inheritance don't usually show up looking like death warmed over unless they're planning something even worse than their previous schemes. But there was something in his expression that made me hesitate, a kind of genuine fear that seemed way out of proportion to losing a business deal, even one worth millions of dollars. "What do you want, Gerald?" I asked, not bothering to invite him inside, but not quite ready to shut the door either. "If this is another attempt to convince me to sell you the farm, you can save your breath. I'm pretty sure we covered that topic pretty thoroughly the other day." He shook his head, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "It's not about the farm." "Well, not directly. Can I come in? Please? I need to tell you something, and I'd rather not do it standing on your doorstep where anyone could hear." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him into the house. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that he looked so genuinely miserable that I was starting to feel a little sorry for him, despite his recent attempts to screw me over. Either way, I led him into the living room and gestured for him to sit down on one of Margaret's ridiculously expensive couches. Gerald perched on the edge of the cushion like he was afraid to get comfortable, which was probably smart given that I hadn't exactly invited him to stay for dinner and a movie. He kept fidgeting with his hands and looking around the room like he was seeing it for the first time, which maybe he was, considering I'd never actually let him inside the house during his previous visits. "I'm sick, Henry," he said finally, and the words came out in a rush like he'd been holding them back, and they'd finally burst through whatever dam he'd built to contain them. "I have the same heart condition that killed Margaret." Well, that explained the pale, sweaty, death-warmed over look. And it also explained why he'd come crawling back to my doorstep looking like a man who'd run out of options and was down to his last desperate play. Because apparently, facing your own mortality has a way of clarifying your priorities, And Gerald had obviously done some math and realized that all the oil money in the world wouldn't do him much good if he was dead. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it, because even though Gerald was a manipulative, greedy pain in my ass, I wouldn't wish a potentially fatal heart condition on anyone. "Are you getting treatment?" He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that suggested the treatment wasn't going as well as he'd hoped. "The doctors say I need a transplant. Soon." And he trailed off, staring at his hands like they might contain the answers to all of life's problems. I was hoping maybe Lily could get tested as a potential donor. And there it was. The real reason for this visit, the desperate gambit that had brought him to my doorstep looking like a broken man instead of a corporate shark. He wasn't just asking for a kidney or a piece of liver. He was asking me to convince my daughter to undergo major surgery to save the life of a man who'd spent the past week trying to steal her inheritance. I stared at him for a long moment, trying to process the sheer audacity of what he was asking. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You tried to con me out of my wife's farm, you manipulated my grieving daughter into taking your side against me, and now you want me to ask that same daughter to donate organs to save your life." Gerald had the decency to look ashamed, which was probably the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him since this whole mess started. "I know how it sounds," he said. "I know I don't deserve any help from you or Lily. But I'm desperate, Henry. I'm dying." I wanted to laugh. Not because his situation was funny. It wasn't. But because the cosmic irony of it all was just too perfect. Here was Gerald, a man who'd spent his entire life believing that money and manipulation could solve any problem, suddenly faced with a situation where all his wealth and corporate connections were useless. "You try to steal my land," I said. "And now you want my daughter's liver too? What's next, my kidneys? Maybe a few pints of blood for good measure." But even as I was laying into him with the sarcasm he deserved, something was nagging at the back of my mind. Something about the way Margaret had been so methodical about everything else, so careful to anticipate every possible scenario and leave me the tools I'd need to handle whatever came up. It seemed unlikely that she wouldn't have thought about this possibility too. "Wait here," I told Gerald, getting up from my chair and heading toward the desk where Margaret had left her laptop and all her other surprises. Because if my wife had been thorough enough to document oil surveys and family financial history, she'd probably been thorough enough to think about her brother's health problems too. Sure enough, buried in one of the desk drawers was a sealed envelope with "For Gerald" written across the front in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a letter that was going to blow up whatever was left of this family's dynamics in ways that would make our previous drama look like a minor disagreement about dinner plans. Spring came to Alberta like a long overdue apology from winter, and I have to admit, there's something pretty spectacular about watching the countryside wake up when you're sitting on your own front porch instead of staring at it through someone else's Instagram feed. The oil deal had been signed, sealed, and delivered under what Margaret's lawyers called environmentally sustainable and ethically responsible terms, which basically meant I was going to get rich without completely destroying the planet or screwing over future generations. Leave it to my dead wife to figure out how to make oil extraction sound like a public service. The money was, well, let's just say I went from worrying about whether I could afford premium gas to wondering if I should buy my own gas station. The kind of money that makes you check your bank balance 3 times because you're convinced the bank made a mistake and accidentally added someone else's lottery winnings to your account. But Margaret had structured everything so that most of the wealth would be managed by trustees and distributed over time, because she knew me well enough to realize that giving me access to billions of dollars all at once would probably result in me buying a solid gold golf cart and a lifetime supply of fancy cheese. Gerald, Thomas, and Patrick had disappeared from my life faster than free samples at Costco, probably off somewhere licking their wounds and trying to explain to their country club friends how they'd managed to get outsmarted by their dead sister and her supposedly simple-minded brother-in-law. I heard through the grapevine, and by grapevine, I mean Arthur, who somehow knew everything that happened within a 50-mile radius, that Gerald's surgery had gone well, and that he was recovering with help from his newly discovered siblings, Rebecca and David. Turns out Margaret's final bombshell had been even more explosive than I'd realized. Rebecca was a pediatric surgeon in Vancouver, and David was a paramedic in Calgary, and both of them were not only perfect genetic matches for Gerald, but also genuinely decent human beings who were happy to help their biological brother despite the fact that he'd spent his entire life not knowing they existed. Margaret had tracked them down, verified their compatibility, and left detailed instructions for how to contact them, complete with family medical histories and what I can only assume were carefully crafted explanations about why their birth family was suddenly reaching out. It was such a Margaret move, solving everyone's problems while simultaneously making sure her brothers learned a lesson about the importance of family that had nothing to do with money. She'd given Gerald exactly what he needed to save his life, while also forcing him to confront the fact that family was about more than blood and inheritance. I almost wished I could have seen his face when he realized that the siblings who could save him were the ones his parents had given away, probably because they couldn't afford to raise them. Lily had moved into the farmhouse with me, at least temporarily, claiming she wanted to help me figure out how to manage the property, but really just needing some time to process everything that had happened. Watching your mother orchestrate elaborate posthumous justice from beyond the grave will apparently mess with your worldview in ways that require extensive emotional processing and possibly therapy. She'd taken over Margaret's old art studio, and I'd been surprised to discover that our daughter had inherited her mother's eye for color and composition, along with her talent for creating beautiful things that made you stop and really look at the world. "Dad," she'd said to me one evening as we sat on the front porch, watching the horses graze in the distance like we were starring in our own personal nature documentary. "Mom really believed in you, didn't she?" I thought about that question for a while, because it deserved a real answer instead of my usual deflection with humor. Margaret had believed in me enough to leave me all of this, but she'd also structured it in a way that suggested she'd known I'd need guidance and support to handle it properly. It was like she'd given me a massive responsibility while also providing detailed instructions and a safety net, which was basically the story of our entire marriage. "Yeah," I finally said, grinning at the memory of all the ways Margaret had pushed me to be better than I thought I could be. Too bad she couldn't have believed in telling me things while she was alive. But hey, better late than never, right? These days, my life looks nothing like what I'd imagined when I was sitting in that lawyer's office, holding that rusty key and wondering if my wife had left me a haunted cow farm. I wake up every morning in a house that's bigger than some hotels, drink coffee that costs more per pound than I used to spend on groceries, and spend my days learning how to be a gentleman farmer without actually having to do any of the farming myself. Arthur handles the horses, which is good because they've apparently decided that I exist primarily for their entertainment. Thunder still sneezes on me every chance he gets, and the mare they call Princess has developed the habit of trying to eat my hat whenever I get too close to her stall. I've accepted that being bullied by livestock is just part of my new rural lifestyle, like how people who move to the city have to accept that pigeons will eventually poop on them. I've also taken up painting, using the art supplies Margaret left in her studio. Turns out I'm not completely terrible at it, which came as a surprise to everyone, including me. There's something therapeutic about trying to capture the way the light falls across the fields in the late afternoon, or the way the horses look when they're running across the pasture like they're auditioning for a Western movie. Margaret would probably laugh at my attempts to paint landscapes, but she'd also probably be proud that I was trying something new instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for myself. Arthur still drinks my coffee like it's his personal birthright, and I've stopped complaining about it because the man knows more about running this place than I'll probably learn in the next decade. Plus, he's got stories about Margaret's secret renovation projects that help me understand how she'd managed to transform this place from whatever it had been into the agricultural palace I'd inherited. And Margaret still lectures me through videos, because apparently she'd recorded enough posthumous advice to keep me busy for the next several years. Most of it is practical stuff about managing the property and dealing with the oil income, but some of it is just her telling me to take care of myself and remember to call Lily on her birthday. Because even from beyond the grave, Margaret was still trying to make sure I didn't screw up the important stuff. Now the farm is mine, officially and completely, and you know what? For a place I was banned from all my married life, it's not half bad.